So now it's time to get our phones out again. Let me pose another instant poll here. And we're asking, has your organization applied for or received federal aid in the past year? Yes, no, not sure are your options. Again, sli.do is the website, or you can use the Q code, scan that, and get your vote in. We'll get the results of that poll a little bit later on. As we mentioned earlier, the pandemic has left many children and many communities hurting. Part of that rebuild is going to take money. Here's the good news. The federal government has unleashed billions of dollars for that effort. Here's the tricky part. How do you get it? Who do you talk to? To that end, we have a couple experts with us to show you how to work with other community organizations to find support for programming, infrastructure, and transportation. First, let me bring up Ronda Jackson. She's the VP of Policy, Advocacy, and Impact at KaBOOM. We're also going to bring up Kyle Simpson, the Director of Government Affairs at the National Recreation and Parks Association. Come on up. Let me just mention here, we do have the results of the poll. It turns out majority said no. So you got your work cut out for you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on how to access and partner to go after new federal funding for parks and recreation. So we know we are the final session between you and lunch. So we ask for your patience and attention and hope that we can say something that will be useful to you. And we will also be doing a Q&A for those interested right after this session here at the bottom of the stage. So I'm Ronda Jackson, Vice President of Policy, Advocacy, and Impact at KaBOOM. For those of you who are not familiar, KaBOOM is a national nonprofit. We are based here in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to end place, space, and equity for good. We define place, space, and equity as a disproportionate lack of access to quality place spaces as a result of systemic racism in communities across the country. We are working to achieve place space equity by building kid and community design place spaces so that kids living in communities of color, low-income communities of color, have access to quality place spaces that they can benefit from in all the ways that we get from a playground: social, emotional, and physical. For over 20 years, we have been able to work with communities to build over 17,000 playgrounds, serving over 11 million kids. And our staff works with the federal government, with the state government, and with local government to make sure that funding is available for play spaces and recreation programs across the country. I'm now going to pass the mic to my colleague and partner in crime, Kyle Simpson, to introduce himself and give an overview of the DC federal policy funding landscape. Kyle?
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda. Hello, my name is Kyle Simpson. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the National Recreation and Park Association. NRPA represents over 165,000 parks and recreation professionals across the country in every state and congressional district. Our members build, manage, and program the parks, courts, and fields that we all use on a daily basis. Our organization is dedicated to building strong, healthy, and resilient communities through the power of parks and recreation. And in my role, I work with our congressional partners and the administration to ensure that our members can access federal funding. I think the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the DC landscape and some federal opportunities that you might be interested in. Groups like NRPA and KaBOOM have been advocating for local parks and play spaces for over a decade. And now we feel that this work has finally culminated in higher funding levels over the last few years. During the pandemic, people realized how important physical and mental well-being is, and how important quality green spaces is in that mental and physical health and well-being. Additionally, the Biden administration has prioritized equity and tackling the changing climate among several other pillars which have benefited local park funding. A few funding opportunities that exist today include the American Rescue Plan, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan as a response to the pandemic. Among many other funding opportunities, the law provided $350 billion for cities, counties, and states to help blunt the economic impact of the pandemic and assist those who were most impacted by the virus. This law has great potential to transform many local parks and impact millions. Ronda will talk a little bit more about it in a bit. As I'm sure you have heard, Congress has also passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law late last year, which include increased funding for new programs that will benefit parks and recreation and play spaces. A few programs that we followed closely that I wanted to mention is additional funding for the Federal Environmental Management Agency's Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, particularly nature-based solutions such as green infrastructure in our parks. They also provided $1 billion to connect local communities that were divided by transportation projects, oftentimes due to systemic racism. This is a very small investment in the total amount of money needed to properly address this issue, but is a true acknowledgement of the issue and the need going forward. There was also $200 million yearly for active transportation projects that will connect parks and schools and other spaces and will be utilized by the recreational trails and other transportation projects. And finally, Congress recently passed a fiscal year 2022 spending bill. After many months of delays, Congress finally wrapped up this work in early March, and President Biden signed the bill into law. This legislation includes many wins for local parks and recreation agencies across the country. Specifically, the bill will also fund a great number of community project funding, or what we used to call earmarks, that will go towards local park projects across the country. These projects will improve playgrounds and park spaces, build sports fields, and help park agencies cope with wildfire dangers, as just a few examples. We expect these projects to come back in fiscal year 2023, and so this is an opportunity that you should be thinking about going forward. Ultimately, states and NGOs have a lot of federal funding available. We are working with agencies to streamline funding requests and to help get this money to states and NGOs as quickly as possible. Next slide. Ronda and I have identified 5 federal programs that are most relevant to our discussion today. We'll briefly walk through those programs and are happy to answer any questions during the lunch, as Ronda mentioned. First is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The Land and Water Conservation Fund has evolved into an innovative toolbox supporting everything from local sports fields to national parks to working forests to wildlife refuges. These tools include 9 programs, including the most important to what we're talking about today, the State and Local Assistance Program, which is administered by the National Park Service. All 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. territories have different processes for allocating these funds. Individual state apportionment is determined by a national formula that is largely based on population. LWCF does contain a requirement for a 1-to-1 federal match, which is where we will be looking for partners across the country to help us meet that match. This match can either be a cash match or a match through volunteer service and hours. The application cycle process for traditional state assistance grants is different in each state. But I can't stress this enough that there's over $200 million each year for this program on the state and local level. In some states, this money is staying on the table and is not being spent. And so I highly encourage you to look into this program. For example, here in DC, they receive $2.5 million each year. California gets $26 million for local park improvements each year, and Vermont gets $2.4 million, just to name a few of the states. Also under the LWCF program is the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, or the ORLP program. The ORLP program is a subset of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and has long been a priority for NRPA. Due to the price of land and other factors, LWCF funding was largely going to more suburban and rural areas. Thus, the ORLP program was designated to provide larger grants to more urban areas that lack local park access. The program has funded some truly amazing projects in its short timeline. For this grant cycle, the Department of Interior has identified priorities, which include underserved communities and projects that support economic growth and jobs in the community. It's important to consider all of these factors when applying for this grant. While cities like LA, New York, Chicago, and DC certainly meet ORLP's definition of urban areas, so do much smaller cities like Dubuque, Iowa. The definition the National Park Service uses when determining eligibility specifies that the area must have more than 50,000 residents, but Congress is also currently considering legislation that would slightly lower that population threshold. Localities that are interested in applying must go through their states. However, the National Park Service decides which projects receive funding. In order to apply, you'll need to reach out to your state LWCF administrator, and you can find that contact information via a National Park Service website, which is linked on our website, nrpa.org/LWCF. Your state LWCF administrator will be able to provide information on how they plan to select the projects that will be sent to the National Park Service for their consideration. The final one I'm going to talk about is the Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP. That can be used for facilities for pedestrians, bicyclists, and other non-motorized transportation. It also includes the Safe Routes to Schools program and the Recreational Trails and Rails to Trail program. Under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, states will be required to use more of their funds from the TAP program for their intended purposes instead of siphoning them off for non-active transportation, as has been done in the past. I'm now going to hand it back over to Ronda, who will continue to discuss some of these funding opportunities with you.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Next slide. Hopefully it changed. So we're going to talk about the Community Development and Block Grants, CDBG, say that really fast 2 million times, is a program that has a lot more flexibility than some of the other federal programs. CDBG grants are administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This funding is primarily used for low-income urban neighborhoods and can be used for many different purposes, including matching the LWCF funds that Kyle talked about earlier, park and place-based equipment, maintenance, procurement, and even community events. It operates on a formula basis, meaning that any community that meets the designated requirements can have access to these funds. If you're interested in seeing if your program or activity reaches this and can apply, make sure that you contact your local government official. And finally, I really want to revisit the American Rescue Plan funds that Kyle touched on earlier. The ARP funds are allocated and distributed by state and local government. Therefore, again, it's imperative that you talk with your mayor or your city manager, city council person, governor's office about what your department needs or about what your organization needs. While it may be difficult to access these funds directly because there's a high demand, the extra funding can help fill holes in city and state budgets and, most importantly, prevent budget cuts. Now would really be a great time to build partnerships to advocate for your community's needs for these funds. We've identified a few areas within ARP that you could use to possibly address your needs. First of all, there is $10 billion of funding from the U.S. Department of Treasury, yes, $10 billion, in response to COVID that provides payments to states, territories, and tribal communities to fund shovel-ready capital projects related to workforce, education, and health. $30 billion at the state and local level for after-school summer education programs. So the U.S. Department of Education has already distributed these funds to states earlier in the year, but state governments will be distributing these funds to local districts throughout the year. Your state's After School Alliance Coalition group is a great resource to get the latest information on these funds. ARP funds can also be used to address maintenance and upkeep issues that are related to the heavy use of parks and recreation spaces due to the pandemic. Ultimately, your city leadership determines how this money is spent, so you should continue to make the case for what you need in your community. It's also really important that when you are making that case, that many voices from the community are considered in advocating for these funds to improve or enhance your local park programs and recreation facilities. Next slide. So what does this mean for you? We hope we have been able to turn your wheels a little bit, get you excited about going after this funding. While there is a lot of money out there for parks and recreation, the success of these programs are entirely dependent on interested parties partnering to request these funds. I would encourage you to do the following. Number one, think about your community needs. A lot of this funding, as we said, is flexible, so don't limit yourself. Make sure that historically disinvested communities have voice in the deciding of your programs and are going to benefit from them. Ensuring equity plays a key role in many of these funds. These projects tend to be more thought out and bigger in size and scope, so please keep that in mind. And you can reach out to organizations, national organizations like KaBOOM and NRPA, but also get with local organizations that share your vision. Consider different funding sources. Once you figure out one or two sources that you think might work for you, make sure that you pay keen attention to the requirements and think strategically about how to apply. So with that, we want to wish you good luck. We are all in this together to make sure that the greatest number of communities have access to quality parks, play spaces, and recreation programs. Thank you so much for your time. We'll be available for questions here at the stage.